Hi, I'm Meg Riley here in frigid Minneapolis, Minnesota. 6 below this morning. Ah! No. What am I doing here back from California? I don't know. And look, it made my head all flat too. I don't know what's going on here. You have joined another episode of The VUU, and I'll have people introduce themselves, our regulars. Aisha, you want to take it?
Aisha Hauser in Seattle, and it is rainy.
Hi, I'm Joanna Fontaine-Crawford in Austin. So, Meg, is this like a barometric pressure thing? Does it kind
of... Heavy is the head that wears the crown. This is Bob LaValle in Buffalo, New York, sunny Buffalo, New York.
Bob is both Mr. Tech Guy and speaking visibly today. And we have 2 special guests today, Lynn Ungar, who is the CLF Minister for Lifespan Learning, otherwise known as Word Girl. Anything that has words on it ends up going by Lynn at some point. And she's also written 2 books. I thought you'd written 2 books of poetry. Bread and Other Miracles is available at www.lynnungar.com, and you're going to want it after you hear from Lynn. I thought you wrote 2 books, Lynn. Did I mess that up?
Well, it's true. I wrote one that was published as a meditation manual a bunch of years ago, and then I subsumed the best of that book and a bunch of new poems into the new book. So if you bought the new book, you'd have like the good parts
in one.
So
there you go. Plug it right over. There we go. Bread and Other Miracles. Excellent. The other one had bread in the title too, didn't it?
Yeah, I figured since I was using the first book as half of the second book. Blurb from Parker Palmer on the back.
Cool. Look at that. Parker Palmer loves Lynn. Wow. And our guest is Nessa McCasey. Nessa is a poetry therapist. I'm interested to learn more about that. She's also a writer and a believer in creativity. Yes. And she's writing a book for the field of poetry therapy, which I will be excited to read. She is a longtime UU and a lover of adventure, and you are in Michigan, am I right?
That's right.
Great.
Yes, I don't think we're quite as cold as you are, Meg, and we have a little sun, which is always nice here in Michigan.
Yes, it's very sunny here. It's just freezing. So, fabulous. Well, before we get to our topic today, which is, to my great excitement, poetry, I'm interested what's up, where people are. Aisha, what's up with you?
Well, I got invited to do a reading for a show that's going to happen at church. We have a lot of theater people at our congregation, and so I'm going to be Eve in Mark Twain's, I guess it's Adam and Eve's Diaries. So we did our first reading yesterday with Adam and Eve together, and it was pretty funny. And it was hard not to talk like I was preaching, so the director kept telling me not to do that cadence that is the minister voice. So I kept having to redirect and be Eve, so it was pretty fun. I said, well, I'm not really an actress. I'm expressive, but I'm not an actress, so that's going to be a challenge and a fun one.
I could see you as Eve. I think that's a pretty good cast. Yeah.
It's going to be hilarious for sure.
Joanna, what's up in Texas?
Okay, what's not? Let's start with what's not up in Texas. Alabama, are you kidding me? Being able to say things like, gee, I'm envious of Oklahoma and Florida and Bama. One of my colleagues is Reverend John Lou Johnstone in Oklahoma, and she and I were talking. She said, if you had told me that people from Texas would be coming up here for me to marry them, never would have believed it. But we're still waiting. The Fifth Circuit still has not issued their ruling. It could come through there, or it could be that we have to wait till the Supreme Court this summer. But still making plans. The church that I serve, Live Oak UU, shares its building with a synagogue, a Reformed synagogue. It's kind of cool having a rabbi right down the hall from me. But she and I are making all kinds of plans so that people can, walk in and choose a minister or a rabbi and get married. We're just waiting for the verdict.
It will be very sweet when it comes. Bob, what's up with you?
Oh, well, I'm glad to be back with the VUU after a month away at Meadville Lombard. Folks don't know I'm a second-year student at Meadville Lombard on my way to my MDiv, and the way it's a low residency model. So I spent most of January in Chicago. Got a little problem with that model, but it was actually warmer in Chicago than in Buffalo. But it's a powerful time of community and learning and deep formation. And I took classes on constructive theology, on multicultural pastoral counseling, and on arts and aesthetics and worship. So the gamut of from very heady to very emotional to everything in between. And I just saw an interesting announcement on the Meadville Facebook page that they had a generous donor come in and give money to the school. If anyone who applies and is accepted for this coming year will get 10% off their tuition for the first year.
Wow,
so
that's nice.
If you've been thinking about div school, maybe this is a pretty good time to apply to Meadville. So
that is a great thing for someone to do.
Seriously.
Wow. Oh, that's fabulous. Huh. Very cool. I was out there early in the month with Bob. I'm the teaching pastor, and we spent a day learning about all kinds of stuff. But one of the really cool things is that Sharon Welch invited in an old friend who has worked with a lot of police forces about changing the way that they do business. And he was, just really talking to the students and ministers about how to take action with some authority in the community. Really interesting. I think a lot of our churches are involved in that work. And he was great. I got to go out to dinner with him and Sharon, and I have to say it was one of the most fun, lively conversations, because he is in his real life, he directs the curriculum for the whole state of Kentucky, all the colleges. So really, really interesting guy. Anyway, it's very fun. So, and it was fun to see that big community there.
Yeah, that's very much in line with the Meadville model of learning too, where their motto is acting your way into new ways of being. So, this idea of direct application of our UU values in how police are trained, it was just perfectly in line with how Meadville does education. So,
yeah, that's cool. Yeah, it's fun at CLF. We had a student who was at Stark King all month, and 2 students at Meadville all month, and then we have people who went to non-UU schools, and I love the mix of you get to learn about what everybody's doing. So. Fun.
The mix is fun. It's not so fun when everybody leaves all at once.
Well, okay, that's
just saying.
That's not the fun.
Sorry about that, everybody.
Oh, you never really leave.
That's the truth. That's right. Joanna didn't get to leave. She's one of those you can check out, but you can never leave. Well, let's see, what have I got going on? I was out at Asilomar, where a lot of ministers are now, this beautiful place on the coast of California, where there is, among other things, a butterfly grove, where the butterflies go on their way to Mexico for a couple of months. So there are literally thousands of monarch butterflies. That was pretty cool. But that isn't why I went there. I went there because I'm part of the UUMA's entrepreneurial ministry group. So we just had our first retreat, and it was really interesting. We had this guy from Stanford Business School who teaches a class at Stanford. He's in the business school on designing your life for students who are leaving college and trying to figure out what to do next, which I think is brilliant. Nessa asked, "What is a Asilomar?" Asilomar, all one word, Asilomar, is a beach in California. And on that beach is a really nice retreat center. And at that retreat center right now, there are hundreds of UU ministers finishing up a week where they will leave tomorrow. I just couldn't go for the whole long time this time, so I went just for the 5 days. But I have to say, you do breathe differently when you're not braced against the cold. So it was nice to get a little bit of breathing in like that, and anyway, it was an interesting group. The UUA invited in also UCC and Jewish people. So it was mostly UU, but it was nice to have to think beyond ourselves all the time. And something else that was fun is that Scotty McClellan, who is best known as the chaplain in Doonesbury, the UU Doonesbury chaplain, is part of it. And I'd spent a little bit of time with him, but not a lot, and he's also a really interesting guy. So anyway, it was good. It was I will, it'll take a while to take what I learned and figure out how to move with it, but it was the first of retreats and gatherings over a 2-year period. So they say by the end I'll know what I'm doing, and I'm like, what if we're already doing it before we knew what we were doing? So, and there are a number of us who are kind of right in the middle of doing things who are there happily. So I got to talk to them.
Sometimes I think ignorance can actually be very helpful. If you don't know the rule, the rules that you're breaking, and you just think, oh, this is what kind of like having, Tom and I were talking about, with having our first child, we can look back now and go, wow, he was a really difficult baby, but we just thought all babies were like that. So I think isn't it the same thing with some of the stuff that we do? We don't think, oh, we're doing anything really radical. We just, we don't know any better.
Yep. The thing that was the most validating to me is that this business of just trying it before you know is how you do it, and I have felt like I should know what I'm doing by now, but apparently just trying till you get it right is the difference between making it and not making it.
Always in beta.
Always in beta, although I learned that the term beta is misused, but I couldn't even tell you how, but I got a 15-minute lecture on it. But anyway, I'm sticking with always in beta. So.
Meg, can I ask you to switch for a minute and talk about the class that you'll be doing with Barb Grieve? Because I signed up for it. My congregation, there's a group of people that really are interested because they're parents of trans children. So I would love to hear a little bit more about it. Yeah.
Oh, I hope more parents will sign up. Barb Grieve, who is a trans religious educator, and I are teaching a class together about nurturing trans young people. I as a parent and Barb as a religious educator. And so we're going to divide it into 2 groups, one for parents and one for religious educators at some points. And, as the parent of a kid who's been trans for a long time, many parents have come to me to talk and say, well, what should I do? What shouldn't I do? And one of the things that's been really clear to me is that no matter how much we are thrilled, love, couldn't be prouder of our kids, we're still grieving the kid we thought we were having. And so part of what I want to do with parents is have a place where parents can show the baby pictures, tell the stories, grieve the losses, not with their child. Because so many parents end up telling their child how sad they are, and the child's got enough to deal with, frankly, with, starting a new life. And so this is a place to come together with other adults and support each other, celebrate together, but also really, I think we'll do a ritual of loss of who we thought we were raising. Now, many parents not of trans children also thought they were raising a different child than they have for a variety of reasons. So I want to be clear, this isn't about, oh, it's just so horrible to raise a trans child. It's not. My child is just exactly who I would want. And I still pictured little gingham buttoned dresses, and other things that are never going to happen. And so the parents part of it is going to really focus there, and then the religious educators part is really going to be how to make sure that that religious education is a safe and encouraging place for people to be. And Barb's been doing that for years, so I think both parts of it are going to be exciting.
So I have a technical question, if I may, because the way we're going to do it at East Shore is we're going to have a TV in a classroom, so we may have, so it's okay to take it as a group, because I'll be taking it with the parents. So it's not, I mean, you said splitting it, so so should I buy 2 spots so that at some point we're splitting off? I don't know.
Yeah, you might want to have a parent spot and a religious educator spot, because there will be different things going on at some point. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. That's cool that you're going to do it together. That's fabulous. I hope you're a model for other churches to do it that way.
One of our OWL teachers actually, I knew you were doing it, but one of our OWL teachers said this would be really good, because we actually had a youth come out this year. Well, it seems that every year there's youth coming out at this congregation, but she specifically said it would be really good for the parents. So I said, yeah, of course. But now, after hearing you, I think we'll get 2, so this way.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. You should share that you're doing it with that model. Maybe some other congregations will do that too.
Yeah, Carrie actually put it on the Loretta sites to do that. So
to do
she
it
also,
that way.
yeah,
Oh, cool.
but
Good.
I'll also let people know I signed up for it. But
Yeah. Well, Barb and I have a conversation coming up, so I'll take that into account. I'm glad you said that. Oh, very cool. Yeah, so we have that class coming up. We also have a really exciting class coming up, at one of which already started and one of which is starting very soon with one of our guests today, Nessa McCasey. Nessa, do you want to describe that class while we're on the subject of classes at CLF, online classes?
Sure. This is the second time we've done this with CLF, and the first time through, I just totally enjoyed it and thought, well, we got to do it again. And we've transformed it now to be a process that will be a little bit more ongoing. We're going to meet twice a month with each group. There's two groups, one that meets on Wednesday afternoons and one that meets on Sunday evenings right before the CLF service. And we're going to be following the theme each month of the Quest newsletter. So this month we're focusing in on love, and we go in not only just into poems about love, but also I'm trying to get them into reading the newsletter a little bit more so that we can kind of really talk about it more than maybe we've done in the past.
So are they writing poetry, reading poetry? What?
A little bit of both. In poetry therapy, let me back up just a little bit and explain that.
Mm-hmm.
Poetry therapy is one of the sister therapies that's in the expressive arts. So we've got drama therapy. You might have heard of music therapy or art therapy. Poetry therapy is one of those organizations. It's a little bit newer and smaller than art therapy and music therapy, but we do the same kind of practice, which is about helping people to express themselves creatively in a way that's supported. So that I kind of call myself, I get to be the best of all poetry teachers because I never grade people. People can break the rules. They can even do something different than what I ask them to do, and they get to be praised. And there's something that's magical something magical happens when we do this. I've seen this over and over again in groups where people suddenly give themselves permission to say what they need to say. And they sit up a little straighter, they talk a little bit more proudly, and suddenly they feel like they're a writer. And I feel like we do things in education that might kind of damage the more sensitive soul. And we start to focus on what's wrong rather than what's right. So back to the course, what we're going to be doing is I'll present a poem or a short reading, and then people will get an incredibly unreasonably short time to write. In the group itself, because it's only an hour, I'm going to try to do 2 poems, and because we're going to also be doing sharing, I can only give people about 3 to 5 minutes at the most to write. And it really does start to it really does start to help people to sorry, I lost my train of thought. By having people focus on that short period of time, it starts to help people get away from it being perfect writing. And so I talk about us just writing drafts, and instead of it being that it's got to come out looking like a poet would write it, which, by the way, most poets will do many, many drafts of a poem before it's ever seeing any publishing. So we really just want to share and talk about our personal expressions, because the way that I say things is going to be unique to me. The way that Lynn says something is unique to her, and we should cherish all those differences among us.
Well, that's really interesting. Go ahead, Joanna.
Yeah, I'm really intrigued by this. I had a congregant at the last church that I served who she wasn't taking. It wasn't called like poetry therapy. It was just, a community college creative writing class. But I know that her experience was that this really unlocked things from her history, including some painful things, so she could really go deep. And I know that she found a lot of healing through it. So I'm just really intrigued by this.
Right. We have in the poetry therapy profession, we have teachers who become trained in this manner. And one of the requirements as a facilitator, that when I do a group, my biggest concern is building safety into the group, so that everybody feels comfortable to write what they need to write, including that people don't have to share what they've written, because it's more important that they write what they need to write than to share. I will try to get people to talk maybe about their process or share a word or two, but mostly it's about doing the writing, and that can be really beneficial to everyone.
I bet. Lynn, is writing therapeutic for you?
In some ways, yeah. I would think poetry therapy is, I mean, I certainly have been known to write in ways that are intended to be therapeutic for me. I think that writing poetry that you intend to put out in the world is kind of like preaching. It's like people need to see themselves rather than seeing you. They need to see you in order to see themselves. So I think if you're writing for the purposes of poetry therapy, you need to see you. What matters is that you see yourself, and to be in a group of people who can see you in that way is really a tremendous blessing. If you want to put something in a book, like I said, it's kind of like if you're going to stand up in the pulpit, people aren't there to hear about you. They're there to use the piece of you that points to something that they can see in them. So it's
right.
It's a somewhat different process for a different outcome. But it's also true that I have certainly shared poems that I wrote because there was something that I needed to say to myself. And I thought, well, I need to say it to myself, but it might be helpful for other people to say to themselves too. So I think it's some of each.
I find this really intriguing, this idea about that just writing it down rather than having it shared is valuable. Because I've found lately that if you ask people, a lot of folks have a deep, deep hurt from the feeling of not being heard that often stems from childhood. And so I'm wondering about, I mean, this idea of poetry therapy as a kind of way of finding one's voice, a way of being heard. But it sounds like that's not actually what's at work.
But I think a lot of times you don't actually know things until you write them down. Or you find out after you've written something down that you know it in a different way than it existed, sort of. When it's just in your head, it washes around in a nebulous kind of way, and when you take the time to put it down, you find out what it is that narrows down and solidifies, and you might find that, I mean, it came from inside you, but you didn't know quite what form it was until you stuck it down there.
Yeah, there's something about writing that's actually organizing for our thoughts, so that in the process of writing itself, even our bodies are becoming organized because we're having to move the muscles, and they use writing as a proprioceptive manner for kids that are having trouble learning. Writing will help them learn. It's the same thing for processing the really deep stuff for us. When I've got a jumble and I can't sleep at night, I can get up and write down 3 or 4 things that come to my mind, and once they're contained, they're no longer having to jumble around in my head, and I might be able to go back to sleep. So there's a lot of different ways that it can become therapeutic, but one of the most important things in a poetry therapy group is that the person is honored if they share or not, and then as time goes on, the hope is that they will become more comfortable and start to share so that their voice is heard, because that is important as well.
Nessa, is it difficult to get people to kind of silence their inner critic?
Yeah, and that's part of the process in the group, is that I model for everybody else in the group, because it helps if there's more people than just me speaking in response to someone's work. But whenever there's something written, we're not critiquing it. In a poetry therapy session, we're celebrating the writing, we're celebrating the words, we're celebrating the person's expression. So when somebody writes something, just like when we're talking here, we're not critiquing each other's language. We're listening for the intent, we're listening for the heart, and that's something we can celebrate. When
I have a question.
Go ahead.
Well, I love to write, but I more write the way I think, and so it's just kind of free flowing. The poetry part is intimidating to me. So, how do you say? Does it have to rhyme? I know it doesn't have to rhyme, but that's the part that's intimidating to me is encapsulating thoughts into actual poetry.
Well, in my groups, I always will say to people that even though I bring a poem to share, because usually poems are short and have a really nice image in them, a good metaphor that they might be able to use themselves or come up with a new metaphor. But I'm always telling people they can write whatever they need to write. They can write a journal entry, they can write a word. We sometimes will write a 5-sentence paragraph that is just about what we do, you know, that it doesn't have to come out like a poem. And there's lots of people who will take that writing and then go further with it. Maybe they want to use it to develop a story. Maybe they want to use it to write an article. There's no requirement that it has to come out looking like any one thing.
Lynn, I'm curious with your writing. Some of your writing, the thing that came to mind most recently is the poem that you did for Black Lives Matter about the wind saying, you know, take a breath. And that was, I used that here at my church, and it was so powerful. Is it different for you writing a poem that will be used in worship than it is for something that you'll be publishing in a book?
No. I mean, I think that there's a difference between personal writing that's for the sake of your own self-understanding and for processing and for depth, and that writing is a different kind of writing as far as I'm concerned. But if I write a poem that's intended to be a poem out in public, I don't think about, is this, I mean, that poem went on a blog post because that was the venue that I had to put it into, and it felt appropriate because it had some kind of political content. But I don't, I mean, I certainly have written poems that are like, I need a reading for this service. There needs to be a poem here, and I haven't found the poem. And since I haven't found the poem, I'd better go ahead and write the poem. So I have written things in that kind of functional sense. But I don't really think, oh, this is a poem that... I go back a minute. I mean, I think, yeah, I write poems that I hope that people want to read. But I think there is a part of me that does write poems for worship, because that's like my minister self and my poet self aren't that distant.
Right.
And so in that sense.
Well, I guess another question is are you thinking at all about the difference between spoken word and written word?
I see. I always, even when I'm reading poetry to myself, I still think of it as spoken word. I want to hear it. I think that part of what makes poetry is that you want to hear it. When you read a novel, you don't particularly think in terms of, you know, what would this sound like read out loud for the most part, although there are some people who you like, ooh, let's stop and read that out loud. But for poetry, I think that part of what's intrinsic to poetry is that sound value, the rhythm, the
vowels, the consonants, that, yeah.
So, yeah, I think pretty much any poem, whether somebody's going to sit, you know, in their couch in the corner and read it to themselves, or whether you're going to read it from the pulpit, any poem is a poem to read out loud. That's what makes it a poem. Well, it's not the only thing that makes it a poem, but it's one of the things that makes it a poem.
What makes a poem a prayer?
Intention. I mean, I think probably all of us have poems that are prayers for us, and I don't know whether the author wrote them intending for them to be prayers likely so. I mean, I think there are people who use a lot of Mary Oliver poems as prayers, and I think, I don't know if you asked her whether she would say she intended them as prayers.
Well, and I think of the Peter Myers song about everything is holy now. I mean, what in our world today, anything could be a prayer. Black Lives Matter could be a prayer. Should be a prayer.
Yeah, mantra.
Yeah. Go ahead, Joanna.
I've often said that now it's a slam poem, but the poem "Say Yes" by Andrea Gibson, you know, about when two violins are placed in a room, if a chord on one violin is struck, the other violin will sound the note. That poem taught me more about praying, you know, than anything I ever learned in seminary.
Yeah, and that's really another component of poetry therapy. It doesn't have to be just about writing. It could be about reading poems. And there's people like in an Alzheimer's setting, we might not be having people write, but we'd have them be talking and listening to poems that are familiar to them. There's so much value in listening to the words. And with poetry, again, it's the sounds, it's the way that the words rub up against each other, the voice, the melodies that we hear as we listen. It's really resonant on so many levels.
Well, and what about memorizing poems? This is something I've thought about. My dad is 85, and you know he still can things that he memorized as a child still just flow off of his tongue. Mm-hmm. Therapy-wise, is there any value in that?
Well, and again, I think it is the older generation that have had that experience more, where we don't have younger people memorizing poems quite as much. I know I keep trying to memorize poems, and they kind of defy me. I can remember lines, but I can't remember a whole poem. But it's really what will work for any individual. If it's frustrating to try to memorize a poem, then we wouldn't want you to do that. If it gives you pleasure, and it's a great thing to be able to memorize and take it with you wherever you go, I'm envious of people who can do that. But I'm not going to frustrate myself if I can't memorize a poem.
But I'm really kind of curious for everybody here, what's like a line or two that you've memorized intentionally or that just sort of struck you so much that you carry it around with you? Do you have pieces of poems that are your sort of sacred bits that you want to have in your head?
Yeah, that are imprinted on your soul. I definitely do, and in fact, I had a very practical use of one. Because I used to do poetry and terp and all that geeky stuff in high school, and so a lot of the poem "Prisoner of Chillon" by Lord Byron I had memorized, and this one time when I was in the hospital, I had come awake, but my body was still, paralyzed and all of that. And just to soothe myself, I was, doing that poem over and over in my head. But yeah, in that poem, there's this particular part, and when my daughter was done with her cancer treatment, these words just came to me because they were so perfect for that experience that you have where you're free, but you're not sure you want to be free, because there is actually comfort in being treated, your child being treated. And it's this line about my very chains and I grew friends, so much along communion tends to make us what we are. Even I regained my freedom with a sigh. And it's just, it's there in my heart.
Wow.
Yeah, it becomes a balm. And it doesn't even have to be a poem. It could be whatever is a notable line. That it could come from a song. I know I've got a husband who loves lyrics of music, and so he will just be in a conversation spouting a line from a Bob Dylan song, and it might not exactly fit in the conversation, but it's such a creative way for him to be living that I think, whatever makes us be the best of who we can be, I think those are wonderful things for us to have in our lives.
Of course, there are those of us who become annoying by fitting lines from musical theater into pretty much any conversation. It's a thing.
You act like that's a bad thing.
Yeah, I can do about
Depends
that.
on who you're talking to at the time. But it's one of those things that, like, grows with any degree of encouragement. So those of us who do that get together, it gets very bad.
Yeah, there can always be a downside for those people.
You know, I think often when I am looking for poetry, which of course now I'm using a search engine. I used to leaf through books to find that poem that I'm trying to remember, and now I can remember 4 words and find it in point.
I love that.
0.00
It
seconds.
used to be impossible to find anything because what you remembered was like the perfect 5 lines out of the middle of something, and there was no way to find it.
Actually, I have a very funny story about that. When Mary Oliver came to GA to speak, she ran into John Hurley, who works for the UUA, and she said, "Oh, Helen Atwin said maybe," Helen Atwin runs Beacon Press, "Helen Atwin said maybe you could help me. I'm trying to figure out if these lines of a poem are written by this poet." And so she says the lines of the poem, and John goes, "I'm not sure, just a minute." So he goes, and what's he do? Of course, what we'd all do, he puts it in a search engine. So he comes back out, and he goes, "Yeah, those lines are by blah, blah." And she's like, "How did you do that?" And he says, "I put it in a search engine." And she says, "Search engine?" She does not use a computer. She does not use a computer. I just thought that was amazing. He said she kissed him. She was so excited about it. Anyway, I thought that was very funny. But I forget where I was going to go with this search engine thing. That often when I use a search engine and I look up a poem, where it turns up, if not on some poetry page, is a UU sermon. I mean, it's really interesting to me how often, even with somewhat obscure poems that I'm looking up, I think, not just Mary Oliver, it'll be in a sermon. And I think we must be some of the few people who are using contemporary poetry publicly to make meaning. I mean, and it really, well, my newsletter column today is that for fundamentalists, faith is nonfiction, and for rigid non-believers, it's fiction. And I think for people like me, it's poetry, which is to say, it's always the finger pointing to the moon and not the moon itself, so I just was struck by that I think we are just use and relate to poetry a lot more than other people. And I'm curious if other people have thought about that, if I'm saying something that you're like, duh, everyone knows that, but it just seems like we're a very poetically centered faith.
Well, I think when you don't have a sacred text and you go out in the world assuming that there are sacred texts to be found all over the place, that's what you end up with.
Well, and I mean, poetry has that magic to bring in metaphor and language and be able to, I think that it's kind of our transcendental practice. And who can, there are certain things, who can say better about making the decision to be inclusive to people who turn their backs on you than, the line about I drew a circle and drew them in, or however exactly the line goes. I think poetry has that magic to connect us and to take us out of where we are.
Yeah, and I think, Lynn, to your point about sacred texts, I think, yes, as Unitarian Universalist, because we don't hold up one, my mother, who every year since she was 17, spends the year reading the Quran, because she's Muslim. I grew up Muslim, and the Arabic is, ancient. It hasn't changed from the time it was written, and to her, she'll read passages like they're poems. I mean, and so, and it'll bring tears to her eyes. And even now, I see her about once a year. She's in D.C. and she'll say, listen to this. This is, about Muhammad, or this is about God, or this is about Jesus. And it just brings tears to her eyes. And for her, that's her poetry. Every single word in Arabic in the Quran is her poetry. So, and for me, like you, Lynn, it's musicals. For a time, I'll spend 2 years listening to the Book of Mormon and another 2 with Wicked, and I memorize every single line, and it's applicable to whatever's going on in my life at that time. I'll pick a song. So that's what I love about being UU.
Yeah, I find when I'm looking for poems for groups to deal with a certain topic that's therapeutic aligned, I do tend to go to UU resources. I've got the books that Marilyn Sewell did, the collections that she did of poetry, and just like Meg said, when I go looking for a poem, it tends to be in an environment that is UU related, which makes me think, oh gosh, that's just like my brain.
So I'm curious about something in preaching. Something that Lutheran pastor Nadia Bowles-Weber has talked about is that you should preach from your scars, not your wounds. Does that hold true for poetry? Because I'm thinking, and I mean, like Rage Against the Dying of the Light, that wasn't scars. His dad was in the process of dying. In fact, he could never share that poem with his dad. What do you think?
Well, in poetry therapy, one of our guidelines is that when I'm presenting poems in a group, I'm going to tend to bring poems that will give some bit of hope. So it has to be a real particular circumstance where I've already got a lot of trust involved, that I could give somebody something that really just opens up the wound. Because there are lots of poems that do that, and that's a good way if you're comfortable opening the wound up and know you're not going to fall apart. But you can't do that if people are fragile. So it just depends on the people that you're working with and knowing them well enough if you're going to give them something that's going to be a pothole they're going to just trip over, or a gully that they're going to crash into and not be able to get out of.
But I think in terms of writing, that's really kind of a place of craft. For poetry therapy, if what you're writing is just for your own processing sake,
right,
and you're just in the wounds, that's good. I think if you're Dylan Thomas, then you have the ability to take that bleeding and put it into something that speaks to everybody who's going through the loss of somebody, and you don't just see through him to your own grief and your own rage. And that ability, I mean, that's where the craft piece comes in, of being able to put your own process, your own loss into something that will speak to other people and not just be about you.
And I think for me the line is, when it crosses over beyond the wound and gets into a thing of beauty, that there's something that's transformative for me when I take my rawness and make it become beautiful, even though it's still raw, but now it shines and it shimmers. And that changes it, and that's what poetry can do.
Well, I think of that, Spirit of Life, the Carolyn McDade song, which apparently was written from a place of pain and longing for her. And I wonder if kind of the intention and prayer comes in there, because that song is clearly a prayer. And I know for me that some really strong writing that has come to me has come as prayer, which is probably as close to poetry as I am, when I am in that place of pain and longing. And it's I think of that Adrienne Rich thing about poetry being the drenching recognition of where we are and how far it is from where we want to be, and what bridges that, both what is found there, Notebooks on Poetry and Politics, which is one of my desert island books, and also Audre Lorde's Poetry is Not a Luxury. They're talking about poetry laying scaffolding where we don't quite have the words, and like Lynn said, or you both said, when you get the words, you suddenly have an architecture that wasn't there before, even if it's very metaphorical and very diffuse, because that's the best you can do in that moment.
But I think that is one of the uses of poetry, to borrow somebody else's line. The poems that really move us are the poems that say things that we know, but we didn't know that we knew them until we had somebody else's words to put on them. And that's just a really incredibly powerful experience, to read something and go, yes, that thing. I knew that thing. There's the words that go with that thing, and now I can tuck those words into my brain and carry them around. And you have that recognition, oh, somebody else, like, it wasn't just me, but also that's how I can bring that knowledge to something that I can articulate, because I couldn't do it my own self. I needed somebody else to do it for me.
So Noel Paul Stookey, you know, of Peter, Paul, and Mary, wrote the song, the wedding song, years ago, and he says that the song did not come from him, it came through him, and he felt so strongly about it that he created a charity foundation, and all of the proceeds from the song go there and pay for, you know, good charitable works. I mean, like, he takes no profits from it. Both of you, have either of you ever felt like this came not from me but through me?
Not in that, like, delivered entire. There's this great TED Talk where somebody quotes somebody else talking about grabbing a poem as it comes through and just, like, almost physically holding onto it and writing it down as fast as possible. But I think that for me, poetry always has this kind of combined sense of things that I would say more float up rather than, you know, rush through, but things that come from somewhere that you didn't know where they were, and a kind of careful management to try and arrange those things. So where it comes from, I don't know whether I have a mystical, the poetry exists out there as spirit, or a sort of Jungian collective unconscious, or if it's just all in the brain somewhere, and if you give it a chance to float up from what you weren't paying attention to what you are paying attention to, then it's there. But I think that for me, poetry has that quality of both being crafted, paid careful attention to, managed, and it kind of floats up like cream, and you skim it off the top and put it in a bottle somewhere.
And I think I've heard of poetry that came from children, and children who don't have a lot of the reservations and restrictions that we put on ourselves as adults can write poetry that they just can do it. So it depends on, I think there's, in my groups, I can see the person that on that particular day, everything just gels for them and it just flows out. But then there's another person in the same group who's struggling with it, and they're getting somewhere, they write a little bit, and then they have to stop and they start again. So I think there can be so many different ways that creativity does flow for us, that there's going to be a good day, there's going to be a bad day, there's going to be a literary day, there's going to be a secular day.
Yeah, I think, well, you know, the poems that I've written a couple of poems in my life, and they do involve massive amounts of revision. I think what I like about prayer is you don't have to spend so long on the drafts, you know. I mean, that was when I've been asked to publish something, you know, which is an intimidating prospect. Lynn, I'm wondering, like, when you are writing, are you thinking about publishing? Are you thinking about, are you writing poetry? I mean, I've only written when someone said, would you write something for X? And it doesn't help my creativity a lot, I guess, is what I'd say. Although, look I did it. I've never taken the time to do it otherwise. That's something about me. But I'm just curious about, Joanna asked about the critic's voice, but about about the voices that say, this is important, I need to do this, the world needs this, you know, like what comes up for you?
I mean, I think mostly I write out of some piece of an idea floats up to the top and I go, huh, like, there's a something here, let's see if we can find the rest of it. And once I've, you know, found the rest of it, if that happens, which sometimes it does and sometimes it doesn't, and I like it, then I want somebody to see it because I'm just kind of like that, like, ooh, shiny, look here. It's like you want your mom to put it on the refrigerator, and this is what's great about Facebook is you can go like, here, everybody, go put it on your refrigerator. So I happen to be somebody who finds it very, in dog speak, reinforcing to have somebody like what I've read, like what I've written. But I don't start out going, I mean, people don't habitually come to me and say, Lynn, we want a poem for the anniversary of the whatever.
CLF asks you for poems all the time.
Yeah, that's like, we need a poem that's about gay pride and creativity. I think that was an actual thing, and I did manage to come up with a poem that was like about gay pride and creativity. So yeah, I mean, I think that there's and I think that this is part of the poetry therapy, that something very useful about saying, here, write about this, because then you go looking for those pieces as opposed to waiting for something to just kind of float by. But I think the question of whether it's something somebody else wants to read is afterwards. First I would write it, and there certainly have been things that I went, yeah, that's just going to sit where it is. No need.
Have you seen, Nessa, people who wrote something from that therapeutic place then turn it into something that's really different, that's more for the world to go in with it? Have you seen that happen?
Yeah, and in my own writing, I've done that. I've done writing that was coming from that therapeutic place that then I could go back and either take that and then create something new from it. But you know, I think it can come out whether you're just, you know, making a grocery list and be something that can be useful for lots more people than yourself. But it just doesn't happen to happen all the time. I just don't think there's any, I mean, on any good day, Mary Oliver might write a really lousy poem, and then on another day she writes a typical Mary Oliver poem. So I think we all develop our own patterns, and I do see people, there's certain people, right now in one of my groups here locally, there's a person who's been really loving when we talk about poetic forms, doing things in those tight containers that have requirements around them. And there's other people that really don't like those at all, but he's really rising to the occasion and crafting his poems. And then I just started a blog mainly because of this, for those people to put their poems out there. And there's something wonderful. I think it's what's happened for years when people say, I'm going to publish a book of poetry or a journal of poetry, that we believe in them in order to get them out for others.
Who doesn't love a haiku, right?
Yeah.
It's
well,
sure.
Yeah, well, didn't you do something on Facebook, Meg, inviting people to do haiku about something?
No,
like a ton of people writing haiku on your Facebook page.
Haikus are so nice and structured. And then another day, remember this, I posted after the Supreme Court, I said I'd write a poem celebrating marriage equality, but I can't think of anything to rhyme with normative heteropatriarchy. And Rebecca Parker wrote a poem. And a lot of people...
She rhymed it?
With it. Yes, she did. It sounds ridiculous.
Yeah, it was like, I can't figure out anything to rhyme with heteronormative, and she, like, Rebecca went on
heteronormative, yeah.
Went on and wrote a poem that rhymed heteronormative. That was quite marvelous.
And didn't sound stupid, yeah.
And if we approach it from wordplay and just playing with words, it changes it from it being a chore to, wow, it's kind of fun to play with words.
Yeah. I'm a longtime supporter of an organization called Split This Rock, which is a national poetry organization that focuses on progressive poetry, particularly of witness and provocation, of voices that don't normally get much play. And they did a great campaign of during the war sending a haiku, of postcards sending haikus to the Bush administration, and it was very effective. And if you'd asked them to just write poems to the Bush administration, people would be like, nah, but the format was freeing.
This question may be more for Lynn. I'm not sure, but what is the value of discipline in writing poetry? Like I was an English major, and I remember one of the assignments I had was to write a villanelle, which is, I found, a very difficult format. I first wrote the worst villanelle anyone has ever written, but then because of that, I was able to go on and write something really good. So is discipline part of your practice?
In the sense of particular poetic forms?
Forms, or even say, I know that there are some people who say, from this time to this time every day, I am going to write. It may be garbage, but I'm, they make it a discipline and not just a free-flowing expression.
Yeah, I mean, I think that if you are serious about writing, you have to commit to doing it. William Safford wrote a poem every day.
He wrote a poem on the day he died.
The day he died. It was actually a pretty good poem, too. Yeah. And they didn't all have to be good. He didn't say he wrote a good poem every day. Every day he sat down and he wrote a poem. A lot of them were good. So what I find is that if I'm really committed to writing, it puts my brain in a particular kind of framework, that what helps most is reading poetry. That the more you read, the more your brain comes into a particular kind of rhythm. You start thinking with a particular kind of rhythm, in the same way that if you watch a bunch of BBC, you're starting to think in a British accent. If you read enough poetry, your brain just starts putting words into that kind of a structure, which primes you then to have some kernel that would be at the center of something that you want to write, and helps you to go into that mode. So yes, if you want to write, it makes a big difference if you decide that you are going to sit down and do it. Am I disciplined as a poet? No. Personally, no. Consequently, I write very few poems. If I were serious about being a poet as a spiritual practice or as a career, I would need to be far more disciplined than I am. But in terms of advice for people who feel like, well, I want to write, but I don't have anything to write about, or I don't know what to say, or I think you can always start with reading. If you can't think of something to write, you can always start by reading something, which I find kind of primes the pump and puts you more in that mode of brain shifting toward poetry as opposed to taxes.
Which seems to be just what Nessa does in her class. And Nessa, I wanted to invite you. We're coming to the close of the hour, and you mentioned you had a poem. Would you be open to sharing that with us?
Sure. This is a poem by Hafiz, and it kind of goes back to our love theme for this month. Even after all this time, the sun never says to the earth, "You owe me." Look what happens with a love like that. It lights the whole sky.
I love that. Thank you. Thanks so much. It's been really fun to talk about poetry this week. Last words from anyone else?
Thank you. It was really nice.
Beautiful.
Thanks for being here. I want to go curl up with a book of poetry now.
Me too.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, and it's not too late to sign up for the Sunday part of Nessa's class. And also, we mentioned earlier the class about transgender kids and youth. And both of those we'll put on the Facebook page of the Church of the Larger Fellowship. They're also on our website, clfuu.org. clfuu.org. Take care. See you next time.
Thanks.
Bye.